Part 22 of Beckside Lights by John Ackworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Haunted Man 1. The Mauvais Sujet. Some 2 or 3 weeks after the opening of the new organ, and whilst Beckside was still in the first flush of its pride as the only country chapel in the Duxbury circuit that could boast of such a luxury, Jabe caught cold again, and was threatened with a return of his old throat complaint. He was compelled therefore to stay indoors on the Sunday. This of course went badly against the grain, and in order to keep the old man ony bit like, Ben and 2 or 3 others called after each service and gave a full and particular account of all that had taken place at the chapel, dwelling at length on the achievements of the new organ and the wonderful way in which Mrs. Dr. Walmsley played it. As the time for the close of the evening service drew near, Jabe limped about in his parlour with his throat muffled up, fidgeting and talking impatiently to himself, and peeping every minute or 2 out of the corner of the window to see if the chapel was loosing. For the life of him he could not sit still. One moment he was consulting the long-cased clock standing near the door that led into the shop, and comparing it carefully with his double-cased watch, and the next he was taking a sip at a jug of balm tea which stood on the oven top. Then he limped to the window again, and after getting as close to the wall as he could in order to see as far round the corner as possible, he stood there peeping slantwise up the hill to see if anyone were coming down it. Every now and again he imagined he could hear the organ, and stood still in the middle of the floor to listen, although he knew, in spite of Jimmy Juddy's solemn declaration that he had heard it in their kitchen, that the chapel was too far away to allow of any such thing. Then he began to snarl under his breath at the preacher, and went twice to examine the plan hanging behind the parlour door, to make sure that the man appointed was not one of those long-winded ones. All at once, however, the front door was noisily burst open, and in rushed Sam Speck, almost out of breath in his haste to tell his somewhat remarkable tidings. "Who does think's been at chapel?" he cried excitedly. "How do I know? Hevna, I know that." And the clogger looked and spoke as if Sam were responsible for his enforced absence and had done him a grievous injury. But just then Lige came hurrying in, almost as much out of breath as his forerunner. And as he stepped towards the hearthstone, he turned to Sam, and addressing him, said, just as if Jabe were not bursting with impatience and curiosity, "Well, what does think now? What's he up to, thinkst ta?" "Oh, what? What are you mathering about?" demanded Jabe in fierce impatience. But before either Sam or Lige could answer, Nathan and Jethro stepped in, followed immediately by Long Ben. Jethro was the first to speak. Ranging himself alongside Sam and turning his head towards him, whilst he warmed his hands at the fire behind him, he asked, "Well, what's the meaning on it, dost think?" And Sam, turning to face his interrogator, knit his brows sternly, and tapping Jethro on the second button of his seedy Sunday coat, replied emphatically, "It means lumber, that's what it means. If he isna efter some naughtiness, I'll eat my head." And giving the knocker up a little push, as if to add additional emphasis to a statement already overladen with that commodity, he stepped back, and putting his hand under his coat-tails, stared doggedly at Nathan. Jabe was on tenterhooks. "What's up?" he shouted huskily. "Are you all gone dateless? What are you talking about?" "We're talking about Job, Skinny Job." "Well, what about him?" "He's been to th' chapel tonight. That's what about him." And Sam glared at the sick clogger, as if defying him to contradict his statement. Now Job Sharples, the pig dealer, had never been to chapel since that memorable meeting at which Jabe had so scornfully returned his niggardly sovereign for the renovation fund. For years before this, Job appeared to have been gradually losing first one and then another bond that bound him to better things, and this seemed to have been the last one. For though the renovated chapel had now been reopened some 18 months, he had never put his head inside the doors, and had come to be regarded by the chapel-goers as entirely lost to them. Of late years, too, Job seemed to have come so entirely under the dominion of the vice of greed, and was so constantly engaged in deep tortuous schemes for his own enrichment, that his neighbours had ceased to give him credit for disinterestedness even in the smallest things, and his most innocent actions were suspiciously scrutinised under the conviction that, when properly understood, they would be seen to be parts of some deep design for accomplishing a selfish end. When Jabe, therefore, received the intelligence recorded above, it struck him exactly as it had struck the others. And so, after standing in the middle of the floor and gazing thoughtfully at Sam for a minute or more, he quietly dropped into a seat, and setting his eloquent short leg in rapid motion, stared first at Sam, and then at Long Ben, as if in search of something in their faces that would give him a clue to this great mystery. "He's happen come to your organ," remarked Nathan at last. Now there was not a person in the company but believed that the new instrument was capable of even this miracle of attractiveness, especially as Job was an old bandsman. But after looking at the others for a while, Jabe shook his head, and the rest wagged theirs in reluctant rejection of the suggestion. "I'll tell you what it is," cried Lige after another pause. "He's coming after Phoebe Green, that's what he's after." Several pairs of eyebrows were immediately raised, and Sam Speck was just about to make a remark evidently confirmatory of this view of the case, when Jabe, with his short leg moving at a frantic rate, interjected. "Talk sense, Liger. Does a dog go courting an old cat after he's worried one of her kittlins?" The elevated eyebrows dropped as Jabe began to speak, and were knitted into momentary frowns of perplexity as he proceeded. But when he had done, every face was clear again, and it was evident that Liger's suggestion was held to be an impossibility, for Job had, many years before, badly jilted Mrs. Green's younger sister Lydia, and had almost broken her heart. And since then, Phoebe, who was more like Lydia's mother than her sister, had regarded Job with feelings of intensest dislike. From this point it became clear that Job's real reason for visiting the chapel would have to be given up, and so, as the cronies filled their pipes and settled themselves round the parlour fire, the conversation turned upon the pig dealer's character and life. After 2 or 3 unimportant remarks, Sam Speck ventured to say, solemnly nodding his head, "There's some folk as is lost afore they are lost, and Jacob's one on 'em." "There warn't a decent a young felly i' th' clough when he were a lad," said Ben gently. "And now there isn't a word," added Lige with grim conviction. "Job," cried Jabe, rising from his seat and taking a swig at his balm tea. "Job's 2 men. There's a soft-hearted, common-sense, music-loving, welly religious Job, and there's a snaking, grinding, split-farding Job. With them 2, spirits fating to gather i' one skin, Job mun have a terrible time on it." Now there was a gradual change in Jabe's tone as he delivered this summary of the pig dealer's character. It went from sternness to apology, and from apology to sympathy, as he proceeded, and so encouraged by a manifestation of a feeling something like his own, Long Ben broke in here. Leaning forward in his chair, and waving his pipe by way of emphasis, he said, "If ever there were an owd angel in this world, it were that mon's mother." "It were that," murmured 2 or 3 together. And then there was an impressive pause, and each seemed busy with his own thoughts. "Nah," said Lige at length, cocking his head at an argumentative angle, and evidently about to propound some abstruse problem. "How dun you make it out as owd saints like Betsy has sich childer as Job, and he were aw as hoo hed too? Beside," he went on, as the position opened out before him, "his feyther were a gradely chap too." 2 or 3 sighed deeply, as if to show that they had often wrestled with the problem, but so far had reached no satisfactory solution. "It's original sin, that's what it is," said Jabe sententiously. "Didn't Christ say as feythers would be took fra childer, and childer fra parents at th' last day? And it is so." "Tha talks as if th' poor lad were lost already," said Long Ben, looking protestingly at his friend. "Lost?" cried Jabe excitedly. "When a man gets to 55 and's going wur every day, if he isna ortert, he ne'er will be." Ben turned and looked at the Clogger steadily, with mingled reproach and indignation in his face, and then, glancing away and leaning back in his chair, he said in tones of slow, solemn conviction, "Job Sharple'll dee a convarted mon." Every eye turned for a moment on this venturesome prophet, and then as quickly turned away from him, and as nobody spoke, Ben went on. "Owd Betsy prayed thousands o' prayers for her son, and deed afore her time wi' meytherin' about him, and as sure as there's a God aboon, them prayers'll be answert." One or two seemed impressed by the solemnity of Ben's manner, and appeared half inclined to believe his prophecy. Jabe himself shook his head, and of course Sam Speck did the same. From this point, however, the conversation took a less interesting direction, stories of Job's meanness and hardness being related by one and another, and all seemed dubious about one or two instances of an opposite character related by Long Ben. Presently they worked themselves back to the starting point, and once more speculated, but without success, on the reasons for Job's unexpected presence at the chapel. On the following afternoon, as Jabe, not quite convalescent, sat musing and smoking in the ingle-nook, who should step into the shop but Job himself? He'd not been inside the Clog Shop for over 12 months, and Jabe thought as he glanced up at him that his visitor did not look quite as well as usual. There was a softness somehow about the red, sore eyes, and the face looked a trifle more pinched than usual. He came into the shop somewhat timidly, but that was characteristic, and so the Clogger eyed him askance and waited for him to speak. Job was evidently ill at ease. He took his snuff in a decidedly nervous manner, glanced uneasily around the shop, stole a sly look at Jabe as if doubtful of his reception, and then, moving towards the ingle-nook and hesitating at the edge of a seat, he said, "Well, I heard yon horgin last neet." So that, after all, was Job's reason for going to chapel. Jabe was a little disappointed, and answered gruffly, "The organ's right enough." "Ay, and who plays it weel?" replied Job, with a little show of enthusiasm, and then he turned and glanced at a seat near him, as if waiting to be asked to occupy it. The erstwhile schoolmistress's musical ability requiring no defence, Jabe leaned back against the chimney-jamb and stared steadily into vacancy. Job made a movement, as though he would sit down, but changing his mind, he took another pinch of snuff and a sidelong glance at the owner of the shop. Would Jabe never ask him to sit? Evidently not. The Clogger could not or would not see what his visitor wanted. But Job had come for a serious talk, and felt he could not open his mind until he got comfortably seated, so he turned and looked round again very significantly, but the Clogger would not respond. Then he propped himself awkwardly against the ingle-nook and blew his snuffy nose. Then he resumed an upright attitude, took a step forward, picked up and began effusively to admire a pair of new clogs standing on the counter. But even this did not move the stolid Clogger, and at last Job, dropping his voice as became the nature of his question, asked, "Jabe, hast niver seen a boggart?" The Clogger laughed, a hard, contemptuous laugh. "Ay," he cried, "Aw sees 'em every day." "Ay, but gradely boggarts, sperrits, tha knows." "Aw know nowt about 'em. It's two-legged boggarts wi' clugs on as Aw'm bothert wi'." Job took another cautious look round the shop, sighed a little, blew his nose again, picked up the short poker and tried to balance it on his finger, put it down carefully in the corner again, and then, leaning across and touching Jabe on the knee, he said awesomely, "Jabe, Aw sees 'em reglar." The Clogger laughed again, but a gleam of curiosity shot into his eye, and turning his head the least bit round towards his visitor, he cried, "Ay, every time tha looks in the looking-glass, Aw reckon." "Jabe," replied Job solemnly, and ignoring his friend's mocking tone. "Aw sees 'em every wick, owd lad. Aw'm bewitched, and it's killing me." By this time it was evident that Job was very much in earnest, and the Clogger, in spite of himself, was compelled to turn and look at his companion. The man's face was drawn and white. His eyes had a frightened, appealing look in them, and dank moisture was beginning to gather on his forehead. "Ger out, tha soft yed. Whoa does see?" answered the Clogger, with an odd blending of impatience and curiosity. "Jabe, Aw sees my mother," and a choking sound like a smothered sob escaped the distressed man, and falling into a seat, he dropped his head into his hands and groaned. "Thy mother? Well, thou'rt no afeart of her, surely." "Jabe, tha knows what a bonny sweet face hoo used to have. Well, it's no like that now. It's dark and fearsome, and it sets me o'er of a whacker, and aw sweets till the bed swims." Jabe felt almost tempted to tell his visitor that it served him right, but the poor fellow's face told such a tale of anguish that he could not find in his heart to do so, and so he sat looking thoughtfully before him without speaking. "And Jabe," went on Job in a pathetic voice, little louder than a whisper, "Aw sees somebry wur nor my mother." Jabe looked up with a large note of interrogation on his face, but he never spoke. "Who does think Aw see, lad?" "Owd lad? Neaw, wur nor him, Jabe." "Wur nor him? Tha canna see nowt wur nor th' divil." "Aw do, Jabe, Aw do," and Job shook his head with a weary, heartbroken moan. "Whey, whoa the ferrups can't see wur nor him?" cried Jabe in amazement. "Jabe," and here the speaker's voice became husky and thick with agitation, "Aw sees Liddy." Jabe felt a cold chill run down his spine, and he was bound to admit to himself that if he had acted as Job had acted towards Lydia Scholes, the appearance of her spirit to him would be more terrible than a visit from his satanic majesty, and so he sat staring before him with an amazed and dumbfounded look. "What mun Aw do, Jabe? What mun Aw do?" Oh, what a sermon Jabe could have preached just then on the expensiveness of sin and the certainty of retribution, but for the life of him he could not compel himself to speak, and his long pent-up anger with his hard, niggardly visitor was fast giving place to a feeling of deep pity. But Job was speaking again. "My mother used to pray for me, and talk to me and coax me. Who'd ha' laid down her life for me, and now who's turned into a fearsome boggart as freetens me life out, and drives me maddlet. And Liddy, they'll kill me, Jabe, they'll kill me." But Jabe could hold in no longer. "It's thy conscience, mon. It's thy bad life. Thou mun repent and start a-doing reet, and give o'er scratting for brass, and then th' boggarts'll leave thee. Nay, they winna leave thee, but the boggarts'll be turned into guardian angels, and instead o' scarring thee, they'll tak' care on thee and comfort thee." Jabe having thus thawed at last, conversation became easy, and Job poured out the whole tale of his troubles to his companion, manifesting at one moment a desire to justify or at least excuse himself, and the next accusing and condemning himself in unsparing terms as the author of much misery both to himself and others. Presently, relieved and comforted by the conversation, he rose to go. When he reached the door, he stood looking at and toying with the sneck for some time, and then turning back, he came to the fireplace again, and standing over the Clogger with fist clenched and a face aflame with shame and bitter self-reproach, he cried, "Dost know what hell is, Jabe? When a chap's badness turns his blessed owd mother into a tormenting boggart and brings her out o' heaven to pester and freeten him, and when his sweetheart as loved ivery hour of his yed is driven out of a resting place to be a skriking ghost to him. That's hell, and that's wheer Aw am." and with a wild despairing gesture he fled from the shop. End of part 22. Part 23 of Beckside Lights by John Ackworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Haunted Man 2. How the Boggarts Were Laid. Job Sharples lived in the first house in Beckside, on the same side of the road as the chapel, and about 100 yards higher up the Brew. It was rather a large house for a solitary bachelor, being a good 4-roomed structure, but old and covered at both ends with ivy. It had narrow windows, a quaint porch, and a forlorn and neglected garden. The house had fallen into Job's hands some years before at a very low price, in consequence of the fact that old Tim Lindley, the original owner, had committed suicide in it. And a rumour, carefully encouraged after a while by the wily pig dealer, had got afloat that Tim's ghost had been seen in it. At the sale nobody would bid, and so it fell into Job's hands at less than half its value, and as Jabe sat musing by the fire on all he had just heard, he could not but see in Job's recent experiences a strong confirmation of the doctrine of retribution in which he was so firm a believer. It was well known in the village, too, that old Betsy Sharples had done her very best to wean her son from his grasping tendencies, and that when she failed, she had solemnly declared to Job that his money would not only never bring him happiness, but would eventually work him earthly shame and suffering and eternal misery. And Jabe saw in Job's present condition a literal fulfilment of the old woman's prediction. The heartless way also in which, after several years' courtship, he had jilted one of the sweetest girls in the neighbourhood could never be forgotten by any Becksider, especially as everyone knew that he gave poor Lydia up because he thought he saw a chance of marrying money, a chance that after all he missed. Poor broken-hearted Lydia, it was said, had, when goaded by Jabe's cold sneers, told him in a passion of tears that he had given her death-blow, and that if she did die, she would come back to him and spoil every pleasure he should ever have. And it was told, too, that after he had left her, Lydia had repented and gone after him to ask his pardon, and to tell him as long as she lived she would pray for him, and that after her death she would watch over him, for living or dying she could never do anything but love him. Then Lydia, after wearing away almost to a skeleton, had left Beckside for a change of air, and since then, with the exception of her sister, Phoebe Green, nobody knew what had become of her, and if Phoebe knew, she never told. This was now nearly 20 years ago, and beyond a rumour that she had died in the Manchester infirmary, nobody knew anything about her. But of course, as Jabe sat musing on these things by the fire, he realised that there could now be no doubt as to Lydia's whereabouts. If her ghost had appeared to the hardened Job, she must be dead, and that settled the matter. As he reflected on these things, his blood boiled with indignation at the pig dealer's harshness towards his gentle sweetheart. But then, as he recalled Job's haggard face and wild despairing looks, he melted again, and felt deeply sorry for the man. That night he paid a visit to Job, and after trying to comfort the unhappy man, he preached him a very earnest and plain-spoken little sermon, exhorting him to mend his ways and return to chapel, and then perhaps the boggarts would trouble him no more. At the same time, Jabe took care not to stay too long, for though he greatly honoured the 2 dead women, he had no desire to meet them again, especially in Job's company. And Job seemed disposed to listen to his friend's counsel, and became most regular in his attendance at chapel. Then he took a pew, a whole pew, though there was nobody to occupy it but himself. His contributions to the collections were noticeably generous, and he began to put out feelers in the direction of returning to the band. At the same time, he improved visibly in health, and appeared passably cheerful, spending at least 1 night a week at the Clog Shop fire. But after a little time less satisfactory signs began to show themselves. He sublet part of the pew he had taken, began to give coppers again at the collections, and was commonly reported to have dealt in the old harsh fashion with a tenant who was behind with her rent. 2 or 3 times Jabe attacked him about these signs of lapsing, and told him again and again that half measures would not do, and that a man like him must be everything or nothing. But Job apparently took no notice, and was evidently fast returning to his old hard ways, when one morning, before the clogger was up, he presented himself at the clog shop, and with wild eyes and pallid cheeks and hands that shook when he tried to use them, he cried as he met the clogger at the foot of the stairs, "Jabe, Jabe, they've been again." "Didn't I tell thee?" cried the clogger. "There's sewer to come. They'll ha' no peace till tha turns o'er gradely." "But I have turned over. Aw come to th' chapel regular, and aw goes i' th' collection, and—" "What's that?" shouted Jabe, with disdainful impatience. "Tha'll ha' to turn o'er gradely, and go to th' penitent form, and jine th' class, and give o'er money grubbing, and mak' it up to them as tha's chiselled, and be a gradely Christian." "Chiselled? Aw hevna. Aw shanna ha' to pay back, shall aw?" And Job opened his mouth and gazed at the clogger with surprise and terror in his eyes. "If tha wants peace wi' God and th' boggarts, tha'll ha' to undo o'er thirm tha's done as fur as tha con," reiterated Jabe emphatically, for he realised that no half measures would suffice with the pig dealer. Job sat for a long time after this, moaning and groaning, and evidently hard hit indeed. Nobody ever charged him with real dishonesty, but he himself knew how much there was in his life that would require to be undone, if this was the only condition on which he could have rest. And as his memory brought back to him case after case of hard dealing and mean trickery, he writhed on his seat in remorse and fear. Presently he rose to his feet. "Aw darna sleep in yon house another neet. Aw darna. Eh, dear, what mun Aw do?" Then he left, and during the day Jabe obtained temporary lodgings for the miserable man. The following Sunday there were 2 large pieces of silver in the collection box, and Job even stayed to the Sunday night prayer meeting. Then he took to frequenting the clog shop nearly every day, and adopted such a humble and conciliatory tone towards those who usually gathered there, that they soon made him feel at home amongst them, and missed him when he was absent. He began also to recover his health and lightness of spirit. And so 2 months passed on, and though Jabe still held stoutly to his contention that Job would never get peace until he gan in gradely, yet he was fain to acknowledge that there was an immense improvement in his pupil all round. Amongst other things, Job had tried to get upon good terms with Phoebe Green, the mangle woman, and elder sister of his old-time sweetheart Lydia. But though he was very persistent and patient, Phoebe would have nothing to do with him, and repelled all his advances with cold and undisguised suspicion. By this time it had got well into autumn, and the Clog Shop fire had a large circle of visitors round it every night. One evening Job was missing, and though it was known that he had gone to Lamb Fold to stick a pig early in the afternoon, no one knew whether he had returned or not. 2 or 3 of the early birds had departed, and Jabe, Sam and Long Ben were seated deep in the ingle-nook, the flickering chip fire fitfully lighting up their faces as they discussed the approaching Christmas festivities. Suddenly there was a dull, heavy thud at the door, and then as they looked alarmedly at each other, all was still again. It was too late for boyish tricks. What could it be? "What the ferrups is that?" cried Sam in startled tones. But though they all held their breath and listened, nobody answered. Presently Jabe rose to his feet and limped cautiously towards the door. He stood a moment to look at it. It was still fast, and nothing unusual could be seen. Then he jerked the door open and stepped back, partly to avoid any sudden attack, and partly to get the advantage of the light. Nothing could be seen, but as he was about to take a step forward, a heavy groan came from somewhere near the door, and Jabe jumped back in a fright. Sam and Ben came gingerly up to his side and stood looking in the direction of Jabe's gaze. Another groan, and evidently very near. Then Jabe, whose scepticism on the subject of boggarts was being severely shaken, thought he saw something dark on the ground inside the outer door. He drew a deep sigh, glanced awesomely around, assured himself that his companions were still by his side, and was just putting forward his short leg when a woeful voice wailed out piteously, "Aw's seen 'em again, Jabe, again, again." Now the Clogger had kept Job's secret perfectly, and neither Sam nor Ben knew anything of what had happened, so with frightened starts they stepped back and looked with scared faces at Jabe. That worthy returned their look with interest, and then, snatching at the only candle that was burning, he brought it forward, and stooping down peered earnestly at the heap behind the door. There, all huddled together, lay the unhappy Job. "Save me, Jabe! Save me for God's sake!" he cried. "I've seen 'em again!" Jabe turned round, put the candle on the little counter, laid down his expired pipe, and then going forward, gripped the miserable Job by the back of his coat collar, raised him slowly to his feet, and led him into the dim light. Job had a bruise on his forehead, and his nose was bleeding a little, whilst his face was white and haggard. "Whatever's to do with thee, lad?" cried the Clogger. But Job's head dropped upon his chest, and staggering towards the fire he fell heavily into a seat. Then, bending forward and propping his head upon his hands, he burst into a cry, and sobbed as if his heart would break. It eventually transpired that he had been to Lamb Fold, and was returning home after dark, thinking of anything except his recent troubles, when suddenly, just as he got down the clough bonk and stepped upon the cinder path along the Beckside, there, right before him, stood the two ghostly forms he had learned to fear so much. Maddened and desperate, Job went from fear to frenzy, and darted recklessly at the spectres, and as they vanished before him, he fell headlong into the beck, bruising his face on a stone and getting his clothes soaked with muddy water. How he scrambled out and got into Shaving Lane he was never able to tell, and he had not much more idea as to how he had reached the Clog Shop. As he sat there, wet and bruised and almost ghastly, he would have been a heartless man who had not pitied him. Everything that could be done to soothe and relieve him was done. Jabe found him some old clothes, and insisted on his changing his wet garments. Long Ben slipped off to fetch some of his wife's famous coltsfoot wine, to which was added a few drops of a mysterious mixture of magical powder concocted by little Eli, rumour said, in the dead of night, and called by him Number 7, which had never been known to fail in casting off the effects of a chill if taken in time. Sam, with a little rag and warm water, carefully washed the unfortunate man's wound, preparatory to applying a green wax plaster, also the invention of the aforesaid little Eli. But even when these things were accomplished, Job seemed ill at ease. His eyes wandered wildly about the room, he started violently at every sound, and when it was mildly suggested that he should go to his lodgings and sleep, he became terribly alarmed and utterly refused to go anywhere by himself. Ultimately it was decided that he should sleep with the Clogger, but as he was still too excited to rest, he sat cowering by the fire, whilst Jabe related to Ben and Sam all that was necessary to enable them to understand the case. The two stayed until a very late hour, and when they had departed and Jabe had administered another dose of coltsfoot wine and Number 7, he put the still excited man to bed and lay down by his side. Next morning there was a solemn consultation at the Clog Shop. Sam Speck, having seen Ben going into that establishment, came hurrying across the road from his own cottage with the remains of his breakfast in his hand, and a great idea struggling for an opportunity of expressing itself in his mind. As Sam entered, Jabe was just finishing his account of the weary night he had spent with Job, who had at last dropped off into sleep, and must not on any account be awakened. "And I'll tell thee summat," said the Clogger in conclusion, and looking with earnest conviction at Long Ben, if there isna a halteration afore lung, there'll be another mon for th' 'sylum. Poor felly, said Ben softly. Hadn't tha better send for th' doctor? It's a soul doctor and not a body doctor as he wants, replied Jabe. This was Sam's opportunity. Crowding the last piece of buttered oatcake hastily into his mouth, and thrusting his head in between his two friends, he swallowed the food, and said at last, If yo two are out about you, you'll cure him yourselves. But Jabe was in no mood for trifling. What's the lumpyhead meytherin' about now? He cried, casting a withering look at Sam, and limping off into the parlour to listen at the foot of the stairs and ascertain whether Job was still sleeping. Sam waited, secure in his confidence, in his great idea, until Jabe came back, and then, putting on a look of greatest gravity, and using his forefinger to emphasise what he was saying, he asked, Yo two's th' heads of th' church, arna you? Well, what be that? Well, doesn't th' owd book say as th' elders is to cast out divils? Tha doesn't call Liddy and owd Betsy divils, surely? Now, bud they boggarts, and that's the same thing. Well, all the bletherin' leatherheads, sithee, I wouldna cast them out if I could. They're doin' him good, mon. More good nor they ever did while they were wick. They're savin' his soul, mon. Well, they're takin' a rough way of doin' it. That's all as I have to say. We might have a bit of a prayer meeting for him, at ony rate, suggested Ben quietly. But just then Job began to stir about upstairs, and Jabe hurried off to attend to him, and the other two departed. Sam, still confident that his plans for Job's recovery was the only likely one. A day or two later the suggested prayer meeting was held, Job himself being present and responding very loudly to every petition at all applicable to his particular case. And whether it was the prayer meeting or the influence of his own fears, or both combined, sure enough, Job was at the penitent form on the following Sunday night. It was a long and desperate struggle, and when the after-meeting broke up about 9:30 at night, though Job declared that he felt a foresight later, the professional judges of this kind of thing could scarcely be said to be satisfied, and Jabe voiced the feelings of more than one when he said, He'll tak no harm for being in pickle a bit. From that time, however, there was a very marked change in the poor pig dealer. He joined Jabe's class, bought a new fiddle, and assisted the band at the Christmas tea party, reduced the rents of several of his poorer tenants, and gratified the housewives living on his property so thoroughly in the matter of repairs and fresh wallpaper that they became loud in his praises, and declared that he was greatly convarted. Then he had the cheap little tombstone on his mother's grave replaced by a marble one with gold lettering, the only one of its kind in the chapel yard, and Jabe and his friends were divided between intense pride and delight in the new stone, and misgivings as to whether Job was not showing off. Then he gave up what remained to him of his original business, and made it over to a former assistant who was poor and struggling. So great, in fact, was the change in him, that the very children noticed it, and the harsh, unsympathetic old pig dealer and landlord became a popular favourite with them. But perhaps the most remarkable of all his achievements was his success with Phoebe Green. He not only got on speaking terms with her, but by obtaining a situation for little Jackie in Duxbury, he seemed quite to have won the mother over, and became so intimate with her that he was once caught by Sam Speck actually turning the mangle. And as Job's amorous disposition was well known, it was confidently predicted that it would end up in a wedding. Early in the following spring, Job ventured to go back and live in his own cottage, and as he was growing visibly stouter and younger looking, it was concluded that he had effectually got rid of his gruesome visitors. Then he began to fettle up his house. He had large new windows put in the front, the outhouses were repaired, and Lige, who seemed to have taken the pig dealer under his special protection, spent much of his time assisting him to weed and restore the long-neglected garden. And of course, no stronger confirmation could be given of the idea that Job was going to marry the Mangle woman, and Phoebe's conduct seemed to give further support to this view. She certainly no longer shunned her old-time enemy, and when quizzed about him, she laughed in a very significant sort of way, and said, in her own peculiar manner, that them as lives the longest 'll see the most. Of course, Job himself did not escape chaff on the subject, and those who treated him to it were encouraged by the discovery that he rather seemed to like it. For years he had been hankering after a wife, but hitherto his preference had always been given to women wi' an owd stocking, and in those days he probably never even thought of Phoebe. She was poor and had 4 children, one of whom was an invalid, but more than all, he knew that the motherly sister of his old sweetheart, Lydia, would have scorned him in spite of his money. But now everything was changed. He could help a brave woman who was making an heroic struggle. Her children, with his money behind them, would make something out, and helping her, Job would be helping himself to popular appreciation, a thing he greatly coveted in these latter days. And besides all this, to help Phoebe was about the only means left to him of making atonement to his conduct to the gentle Lydia. Job did not conceal from himself either that Phoebe, though proud and close, was a clever managing woman, and would be a great help to him in the plans he had formed for the future. All these things therefore made the village talk very pleasant to Job, and he redoubled his efforts to ingratiate himself into Phoebe's favour. For 4 months now he had seen no boggarts, and declared almost every day at the Clog Shop that he had never known what life was until now. One evening in the early summer, after a hard day's work in his garden, he had seated himself on the little side seat in the porch at the front of his house, and with a pot of nettled beer at one side of him, and his snuff-box in his hand, was musing on his future and his possible chances of winning Phoebe. The look on his face told plainly how pleasant were his thoughts. The air was laden with the scent of wallflowers and early roses, and musical with the songs of the birds. All nature seemed to smile upon him, and as he looked around at the bright flowers and white-blossomed hedges, he heaved a great sigh of contentedness and murmured softly, "Eh, God's good, God's very good." As Job sat musing thus, a woman stole out of the mangle house at the bottom of the village, and turning into Shaving Lane, crossed the stile and began climbing slowly up the hill towards the Duxbury Road. She was of about medium height, with small regular features, soft dark eyes and a clear white skin. Evidently she was about 37 years of age, and a fair example of that type of Lancashire woman who is fairer at 40 than at 20. She looked a little nervous and preoccupied, and every now and again a soft warm light rose into her eyes and made her face look tender and sweet. When she got over the stile into the road a little above Job's house, she paused and glanced rather anxiously about her. Then she sought the shelter of the high hedge, and stole quietly down towards the cottage, with her heart beating almost into her mouth. When she got close to the house, she stopped, and after looking cautiously around again, she bent her head, and peeping through the hedge caught sight of Job sitting in the porch. Her eyes suddenly filled with tears all shining with the light of a joy that was almost holy. She put her hand on her beating heart, and sighed, and then bent down and peeped again, a good, careful look this time. Then she took a step nearer, and touched the gate with a hand that trembled so that it shook. "Job!" The musing pig dealer started with a terrified cry. The colour left his face. He rose to his feet hastily, and opened his mouth to shriek. But just then the gate clanked, and in another moment 2 soft plump arms were thrown around him. A hot tearful face was laid against his, and a low eager voice cried, "Bless thee, lad! Oh no, that come reet. God does answer prayer. Bless thee, lad." "Liddy!" cried Job, almost beside himself. It's no thee. Thou'rt no wick. Eh, wench, wench. And Job folded his arms around his long-lost love and hugged her to his heart. Yes, it was Lydia. She had not died after all, but had been in service in London, and kept up secret communication with her sister Phoebe. She had waited in prayerful faith and hope all these years, and at last, at her sister's instigation, had come home to her heart's only love. And there they sat in the little porch, laughing and crying together, and making mutual confessions and vows for a happier future. And as the sun dropped behind Wardle Hill, and the birds ceased their songs, poor Job at last found peace, and all the wealth of a woman's unwearying love. End of Part 23. End of Beckside Lights by John Ackworth. Read by Phil Benson.